First of all, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
Tell me a little bit about your background and your relationship to climate sciences so that we can understand the degree of your level of expertise.
Sure. By training, I'm a biologist and environmental scientist. So my bachelor's was in general biology, my master's is in molecular biology, my doctorate is from UCLA in environmental science and engineering. After getting that degree, I went to work on environmental policy, including climate policy, beginning in 1996-97. I started studying climate policy by reading the second assessment report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and then as well as several years of the previous literature on climate change.
Hang a second, you've actually read the IPCC report?
I read the second assessment in full, yes. It was very painful. But I wanted to, if I was going to write about the subject, I wanted to make absolutely sure I was up on the latest scientific research. And so I then began writing about climate change. That led me to be invited to be an expert reviewer. So I did that, which means I read that one as well. And I also was invited to be an expert reviewer on a special volume from the IPCC on aviation and the global climate.
So more than 20 years you've invested in your life
yes.
Dealing with climate science.
Essentially, yes.
When you watch the current debate, what's the thing that causes you the greatest amount of concern when you hear what is being put forward as being the latest science based on what you know?
My biggest concern is the politicization that has happened. When I read the second assessment report, it was a very straightforward collection of the underlying science. It was quite humble in its willingness to draw hard conclusions. It acknowledged uncertainty with no reservations. It was an effort to understand what is. But since the second assessment report, I've watched as the IPCC process and the people who are involved have grown more and more. One could say this process was corrupted by the tendency of the scientists to become activists and to start directly demanding certain public policies based on their knowledge and to start increasingly overstating, in my opinion, the level of confidence we have in what we've learned. I find those to be very troubling trends.
When we take a look at what's happened with global temperatures over the last 20 years, there was a period in the 1990s when they actually were rising and everybody was pretty much in agreement that the temperature was going up. Since then, though, what has happened to global temperature over the last dozen or so years?
Actually, it's around 18, and depending on if you look at the satellite record, which goes back to 79, there's no significant trend. So what has happened is that there's been a pause in the rate of change of the atmospheric temperature record, of the surface temperature record, and the satellite temperature record as well. The reasoning behind the pause, and to be completely fair, environmentalists, many of them, and some climate researchers, deny there is a pause, instead claiming that the missing heat is being stored in the ocean. But that's one of about 66 excuses that have been put forward to explain
66.
Yeah, to explain the pause. All 65 of which have essentially been debunked. So what we know is there seems to have been a pause in the rate of increase. That pause is unexpected because our greenhouse gas emission levels have continued to rise. And
We're now in excess of 400 parts per million.
That's right. And so it's very challenging to explain how it is that you can have the greenhouse gases rising, but the temperature staying stagnant, unless you postulate that there are other drivers of the climate that are stronger than the greenhouse gases. And the primary thing we learn from the pause, because the thing about climate change, of course, is that the climate has always changed. Climate stasis would be the unusual thing if it held for any length of time. Computerized models of the climate didn't include the idea of a pause. The climate models show essentially linear rise in temperatures to correspond with linear increases in the greenhouse gases. And so what we know from that is that the models themselves are wrong, and are very likely to be wrong. We'll know the certainty of.
You mean by virtue of the fact that they didn't account for the fact that there could be a pause?
That's right, and their models don't really allow for a 20-year pause. By the time A 20-year pause should be an unbelievably rare event in the climate models. So if we see that, we're going to know the climate models themselves are broken. And this is where the science meets the policy, or what I like to say, the science actually meets the end of science, which is when you enter the land of climate modeling, you're no longer doing normative science, right? You're no longer measuring something empirically. You're no longer taking the Earth's temperature, which, by the way, is a heck of a tricky process in and of itself.
Right.
But
Yeah.
claiming you have built a model of the Earth's climate that has enough detail in it to make predictions about the future of the climate, given the Earth's nonlinear systems, chaotic systems, to me, that's not science. That actually is a computerized astrology. I am deeply skeptical of predictive models. Now, I would also point out I'm deeply skeptical of predictive economic models, and I would always been deeply skeptical of predictive models for oil prices. As anyone looking at the gas pump today should look at that and say, did anyone predict this? No.
No.
What were we being told only 6 months ago? That we'd never see oil under $100 a barrel again, and we were facing peak oil.
You brought up this, and it's a place to get started on how do we start to understand exactly what is happening as far as temperature. How long have we had the ability to measure the temperature globally, or can we even do it yet based on what we have?
Modern temperature records go back about 150 years to the 1880s. Over that time, they were not taken with the aim of actually establishing a global average surface temperature. They were put in places to record the temperature for the purposes of tracking seasons so you know when to plant and things like that, right? Over time, the technology changed as well. In the 1800s, they had hand-painted glass thermometers. They didn't have standardized processes for taking the temperature. These were generally volunteer efforts around the world. And it's even more crazy when you talk about water temperatures, because, of course, they didn't have GPS systems, so no temperature was taken in the same place twice. And the evolution of how they took the temperatures of the water, when you think about that, at first they dropped canvas buckets over the side of ships, hauled it up, put it on the deck, took its temperature. Then they moved to wooden buckets, then they moved to plastic buckets. Meanwhile, the ships got taller, and the air draft got more. And then finally they moved to inlet intakes of water that brought water in to cool the engines. And
But that's still
measure
surface water that they're taking.
It's just, yes, it's still near surface water. And it's patchy. It's very patchy. And so to take the Earth's temperature, what they do is they take the readings they have and they create an average, essentially. They create a 3D average of the data they have. And that's what we call the surface temperature record. There's another set of records since 1979 when they launched the first satellites that would look at the Earth's temperature. They're actually called microwave sounding units because they use microwave radiation to read the temperature of the atmosphere, but it's higher up. It's higher up in the atmosphere. It's not the surface temperature that we look at. So those are the records we have. And in a long-term history of a 4 billion year climate, 150 years of data is not a lot to be drawing hard and fast conclusions on.
Ocean temperatures, they do appear to be on the surface rising.
Yeah.
There's pretty
above the
solid...
Yeah, I think above the 700 meter level, they're rising somewhat, yes.
And this may be may lead some credence to the argument that maybe this is the sink of the extra heat that has now plateaued.
Some, but again, and I should step back. I should step back and say, I actually believe in global warming. I understand the chemistry of the greenhouse gases and how they trap infrared heat in the atmosphere. I just believe that when you actually look at what we've seen, the physical trends we've seen, they're much, much lower than what the climate models, those models we talked about, project. And it's those projections that we're supposed to be acting upon, not the actual measured temperatures.
So you're not a denier about the fact that the world is
No.
warming.
I mean, absolutely not. I could, it's easy enough to explain. If I have a teacup and I shine a light through it and I measure the light coming out the other side, and then I add tea, what's going to happen? Some of the light's going to get trapped in the molecules of the tea. I won't measure it over here. My tea will get an infinitesimally bit warmer because it's trapped the heat energy of the light, and now it's right. If I do the same thing with infrared radiation, which is just another form of light, and I pump in a greenhouse gas, which tends to intercept those photons, it'll slow them down. I mean, it's just straightforward chemistry, right?
It's chemistry.
It's just chemistry. Again, it's the assumptions that lead to the higher estimates of warming that are placed in the computer models that I don't regard as in the same category of science as normative chemistry.
Is our burning of carbon a contributor to that?
Almost certainly. Almost certainly. We are probably causing a mild warming. If you look at the regular physics equation of how warming works, what you find is that if you double the level of CO2 in the environment, you would expect about 1 degree centigrade of warming. And
So to double it.
to double it.
Yeah.
So theoretically, we'd see another 0.3 to 0.4 degrees of warming by the time we hit doubling.
By the middle of this century.
Which by nobody's standards constitutes a disaster, particularly. And in theory, subsequent doublings should be less because you'll have already captured some of the outgoing radiation. So you can't capture it twice, right? It's like, in the sense that once you put on enough blankets to stop your heat from radiating out, more blankets don't do much.
So even when Mitt Romney comes out and says that he now recognizes that man-made carbon contribution is a factor in global warming, is he right?
Yeah, of course he's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's right. I mean,
Whereas he was uncertain or he denied that in the past. Now he's come to accept that this is the science.
there have been a few people who denied the science in the past. Not nearly as many as people think. I mean, I know most of the people who are skeptical about climate models as I am. They're skeptical about climate assumptions as I am. But all of them that have scientific training that I know understand the chemistry and say, well, of course, if we increase the carbon content of the atmosphere, we're going to trap some heat. How much, we can argue about for a very long time. And even more importantly, what that heat will do is even less known.
And that's the issue, isn't it?
That is the issue. What does this heat do in terms of changing the climate? But these are the things we need to know, which is exactly how much is going to raise sea levels. Exactly what influence is it going to have on weather patterns, precipitation patterns? Will it cause droughts? Will it alter the patterns of wind wind zones, right? Of wind movement around the world. Those are the things we need to know if we want to talk about what the harms would be. But those are the things we know the very least about.
Well, one of the things that gets pointed out is that if all the ice in the world melted, we'd see the oceans rise by about 10 meters, as I understand it. This is a figure that I've heard, 33 feet, 10 meters, something like that.
That could be about right. But of course, at the rate of warming, humans are likely to be practically extinct by then. But
to melt all the ice.
yes, to melt all the ice.
And that's all the ice.
There's a tremendous amount of ice. So, that would be many, many thousands of years in the future, I think.
We go back.
And of course, that presumes we'll still be burning fossil fuels in the year 2500 or 2800, right? Which anyone who's willing to make predictions about things like that, I think doesn't deserve a serious place at the table, because we have shown, right, in the last 20 years how bad we are at predictions.
So, I'm the average person, and I'm looking at all of this, and I'm trying to make decisions in my life, how it's going to affect the way that where I live, how I get myself around, who I'm going to vote for. All of these things, and therefore public policy that gets made around all of this. What kind of guidance can you give to somebody that says, here's how you can make some sense of this? Because there are emotional messages on all sides of this debate that become confusing and make it difficult for the average person who it's not their life to figure this out. They want to be able to look to somebody and say, okay, I trust that source.
It's difficult for the average person to be able to understand. First of all, our level of science education in Western and developed countries is abominably low.
I love to quote Carl Sagan on that. We've created a society so utterly dependent on science and technology, and yet at the same time we've created a society where virtually nobody knows anything about science and technology.
That's right. And then people who tend to speak about science are not very good at stating the levels of confidence without and certainty that's involved.
Because they're scientists and they deal in gray areas, and they want to recognize the fact that there's ambiguity in the work that they do.
And they also want to believe their own work.
Yes.
If their climate models say 8 degrees, 10 degrees, then they're going to say they're confident and they're certain about it, because otherwise nobody's going to publish them yet, right? So I think one's own conscience, in a sense, is the place to start. and that is, and a true picture of what we know today. 2.5 billion people in the real world suffer from dire energy poverty. They don't have modern electricity, they don't have modern cooking fuels, they don't have the ability to refrigerate drugs, they don't have motorized transport. They live lives that are of unrelenting toil. They grow ill and die from things that we would shrug off or take over-the-counter medications for that they can't get. Mm-hmm. And that number is going to increase as the world population increases. Understand that in the context that 87% of all the power generated in the world right now comes from oil, coal, and natural gas.
87%.
87%. 80% of all transportation moves by oil derivatives. Gasoline, diesel, bunker fuel, jet fuel. And we have no replacements for virtually any of those that are either scalable or cost effective, cost comparative. So the reality is, no matter what you think about the climate, whether you're a lukewarmer like I am, or you're a high-end warmer like somebody else is, you have to understand that the 2.5 billion people, a third of humanity, has the right to develop. And they're only going to do that with low-cost energy sources. And those are the fossil fuels. And so I think any discussion has to start from the moral principle that we need to understand that humanity is actually an energy civilization. I wrote a book when I was at the American Enterprise Institute in which I pointed out that humanity's harnessing of fire, the first way we harnessed energy, actually changed us as a species. There's anthropological evidence that we co-evolved with fire. Mm-hmm. And so we are actually Homo igniferens, the apes that light fire, which is what distinguishes us from virtually everything else.
And we started to eat cooked foods, which changed our biological development.
Changed the size of your brain, changed the shape of your jaw, changed everything about you. And so I think that's the first thing, is that we need context. If you're going to start the discussion, you need context. Now, you then need to ask, okay, if using these fossil fuels comes with downsides as well as upsides. We know it comes with upsides, right? Modern medicine, modern housing, modern education.
The ability to produce this show.
The ability to produce show. Every day we use, our lives are made better and longer living and healthier because we consume vast flows of energy, as a matter of fact. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging that upside has the downside. No question, right? So mining is not necessarily pretty. It does despoil the environment for time if you remediate it, which is increasingly the legal requirement. It's a temporary disturbance, but it's a disturbance. If you burn it inefficiently, you generate conventional air pollution of various sorts, which we know to have health impacts. I'm asthmatic. I lived in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles when I was a kid. Wow. I can assure you, I know what air pollution does to people's health, and that you want to stop that. You want to enjoin those harms. The problem is that for those problems were easily solved compared to carbon emissions, because the carbon emissions are fundamental to everything we do, and they're inert. Mm-hmm. You can get particles out of the air with a filter, right? With filters. You can get chemicals like sulfur dioxide out of the air because it's chemically active and you can trap it. You can catch it with various catalysts. Same for other traditional pollutants. You can control them. Your catalytic converter in your car is a case in point. You can't treat carbon that way. And so it's a very different thing to say we want to get rid of carbon emissions, or and that's a misleading term anyway. It's carbon dioxide emissions. Mm-hmm. Because they are essentially, they're a very different beast when it comes to trying to solve the problem.
So this brings us back to, as an individual, I look at my own life and the world in which I live and say, okay, there's a risk. There is a price that we pay for this. Nick Bostrom at Oxford University, he has been given basically this assignment by the university to start thinking about how do we then say what's worth the risk and what isn't. Mm-hmm. And where do we know where that line is that we say now it's no longer worth the risk?
Again, I don't think there's a clear answer for that, because different people will have different levels of risk aversion and have different values of time and concern for future generations, and we'll have a different idea of what's a tolerable infringement on the environment in exchange for the benefit you get. Everybody's going to have their own answer to that question.
So if we want change, we individually are part of the answer.
We are, but to be honest, I mean, the environmentalists are correct about this, which is your individual choices are not going to be nearly enough to make major change to the greenhouse gas emission concentrations in the world. That requires a complete turnover of technology, which is radical.
I tend to think that we're a pretty resilient species. Otherwise, there wouldn't be
No, I agree.
7.5 billion of us right now.
Absolutely.
And we're going to figure this stuff out. So do you remain an optimist about our well-being and our ability to adapt to a changing world?
Generally speaking, I'm optimistic. And I'm optimistic even about climate policy in the sense that it's one of the reasons I wanted to go to work in the energy space, is that at the end of the day, if you want to impose a climate policy today, the people today will get the bill. And then they'll have to make ask the exact question you asked, which is they're going to see their carbon bills, essentially. And they're going to have to ask themselves, what value do I think I'm getting for what I'm paying? Mm-hmm. That's when they're going to say, I really don't think it's worth this amount of money and changes to my lifestyle today. As we move forward, I have faith in people. That is, they're going to realize that they're being overcharged today for an exaggerated risk reduction tomorrow. And not even their tomorrow, their kids' tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So I'm optimistic that we won't get into economic ruin because the climate, people who are alarmed about the climate won't drive us into economic ruin because people are innately logical, reasonable about these things.
Well, thank you for that, because I too am optimistic. And yet there are so many people who think, nope, we're driving ourselves off the edge of the cliff.
I really feel sorry for those people who have the apocalyptic vision, because they can't be very happy people. And to the extent that they're honest people, they must deprive themselves of an awful lot of opportunity today for little or no gain to be had in the future.
Well, thank you for this refreshing look at climate. And I enjoyed it. It went in directions that I wasn't anticipating, but it was refreshing.
Good.
Thank you very much.